Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Shawn.
Okay. How many of you folks are excited about talking to an attorney today? Liars in the group. This is just a wonderful start in general. I have spoken on this particular topic now for, 20, 25 years in different permutations in different ways. I've been involved with the United Way of Greater Topeka and now United Way of Kaw Valley in doing this in conjunction with our Leadership Institute at Washburn and United Way for folks that wanted to serve on nonprofit boards. For myself personally, I've served on multiple nonprofit boards in pretty much every role you can come up with, all the way through board member up to president. And I currently serve as chairman of the board for the Board of Trustees for the Topeka Shawnee County Public Library. So after I'm done with you today, I get to go have a public budget hearing, our annual public budget hearing, and see how many of our citizens are mad at me for raising their taxes. So we'll enjoy this hour at least, and we'll see how that hour goes after that. When I was asked for a title today, the title that they ended up with is Best Practices for Board Development and Engagement, which seems kind of dry to me. Doesn't really capture, I think, what you guys are interested in asking about. My suggestions for a title, I like to share these with you. The first one was Legal Obligations of Nonprofit Boards and Board Members Doing the Job Right to Attract and Retain Good, Productive Board Members. Kind of long, but a little more descriptive about what I'm going to try and talk to you about today. Or the more important version that I think really gets to the point that I'm going to come back to multiple times in our conversation today, boards should ask lots of questions. Because that's one of the things boards don't do that ends up being problematic in multiple different ways. Everyone kind of prides themselves on that magical, we had a 10-minute meeting today and we got everything done. Well, that's horrible. That doesn't accomplish anything for your board. You're not talking about things, you're not engaged, you're not doing the things you need to do to actually be productive. So I'm not encouraging you to ask questions in a bad sort of way, but in an engaged sort of way. So you kind of know what's going on. So your board members they're advised, they feel like they're confident in the decisions they're making, they're asking questions. It's that engagement part of board engagement. So I'm going to walk you through the legal and ethical obligations of board members today. That's the lawyer stuff I'll go through. We'll talk about conflicts of interest a little bit as well. And then I'm going to have a hypothetical problem that I'll give you that we'll walk through and just kind of get your thoughts and feedback on applying these kind of concepts and ideas as you might apply them with a real world board. Fair enough? Try to make it reasonably interesting, hopefully. And I've been recovering from losing my voice, so bear with me if I get more iced tea than I usually would. Board members should understand the legal duties of the board. In multiple different resources out there, these are referred to quite often as the 3 Ds, the 3 duties. And for me, most importantly, F, the fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty kind of touches all 3 of the others, the duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. And it's basically that overriding principle that you're responsible for this thing, this organization, this entity. Without sounding political, a few years ago, the courts decided that corporations were people in America. And for nonprofits, your nonprofit corporation, especially if you have a true 501c3, it's an entity, it's a thing, it has a life of its own. So part of the leadership over these entities is to make sure it's being a responsible corporate person. It's doing the things it's supposed to do. And that's where you can both get into trouble as a board member and also take steps to avoid liability if you're a board member in these boards. A lot of material that I'm going to have in the next few slides comes from boardsource.org, resources, legal duties, nonprofit board members, the definitions. Pretty much the same definitions are in about 80 different places if you get on the internet. But these are really kind of straight and straightforward and to the point. So if you want to have a resource to kind of provide this to your own board members when you go back, that's a good place to get just kind of a real straightforward, simplified version of this. They also have a PowerPoint version out there that goes over some of it as well, if it's something you want to touch on. First thing I want to talk about is the duty of care. And my print's kind of small up here, so I'm going to look over here. I'm going to try not to read all through these. And some of you kind of like to read ahead, so I give you more of the material up here. But I want to kind of summarize it a little bit. Duty of care describes the level of competence that's expected of a board member and is commonly expressed as the care that an ordinary prudent person would exercise in a like position under similar circumstances. Basically means the board is expected to exercise reasonable care when they make decisions on behalf of the organization, as you might in your private or professional life. I get information, I look at all the options, I weigh the decisions, I make choices. It's that process, it's that prudent person sort of process. The duty of care requires you to pay attention to the organization's activities, their operations, make decisions with the organization's best interest in mind. I teach law students a lot of family law concepts. And family law, all apologies to my fellow professors that teach family law. Family law can be boiled down to one thing: best interest of the child. That's all of family law. There's permutations and it's complicated, but that's it. And this is the same thing. It's those best interests of your nonprofit organization that you're needing to serve. Breach of a duty of care, excessive meeting absences. If you have folks that are not showing up to meetings, you need to address that. I regularly see this, and one of the best things you can possibly do is add to your bylaws, add to your policies, add to your procedures, whatever you use, a provision of if you fail to attend at least 2/3 of the meetings, whatever number you want, then we'll take action to remove you from the board. Don't just let it go. Those are the folks that become problematic because they don't have the information, they're not attending, they're not making decisions, they're exposing themselves to liability and potentially exposing you to liability. Unless you're really wanting folks on the board just to have their name on the board sort of thing, it's not a good idea to keep those folks that are not actively engaged or attending. Failing to ask questions, coming back to my question thing about proposed actions or steps or information or whatever. Board member can only do their job effectively if they've been present at meetings and received and digested the information intended to make decisions. One of the problems I regularly see as well is boards that get their packet on the desk in front of them right before the meeting. It's horrible. You should have it at least a day ahead. I encourage a couple days ahead, send it out via email, have a chance to look at it, read it, skim over it. Not that everybody will read it completely, but have a chance to look at it and then bring your questions to the meeting. If your folks are just handing everything to you literally right before the beginning of that meeting, you're not knowledgeable about what's going on and you're not prepared to ask questions. It's not a good practice. So whatever you can do. And that's not to say there won't be things that come up last minute that you have to deal with. That's understandable. But if the routine practice is that in and of itself is also problematic and a good way to kind of get into trouble with some of these issues. That's all the other things I kind of suggest. So there's duty of care. Duty of loyalty. Loyalty means board members are expected to put the interests of the organization before their own personal and professional interests. Organization should come first. It's a conflict of interest policy embedded in the nonprofit law regarding charitable board members, in essence. The duties intend to make sure the organization is foremost in decision-making by board members. Includes an expectation that board members recuse themselves if there's a vote that could benefit them or family or with which you have a conflict. The law has set an expectation of loyalty to the organization first and foremost. It's still best practice for organizations to have a formal conflict of interest policy. I'll talk about that here in a couple minutes. Board members should complete a form each year disclosing conflicts, updated every year. And a committee or subcommittee of the board should review those and make a recommendation if there's a conflict, if there's a true issue that arises. That's your duty of loyalty. Duty of obedience. Duty of obedience requires board members to comply with the applicable federal, state, and local laws, adhere to the organization's bylaws and policies, and serve as guardians of the organization's mission, includes honoring donor intent. Some states have additional requirements for different titles. Encourage you to look up the laws of your own state. How many of you have a copy of the bylaws of the nonprofits you serve on? How many of you take it with you to each meeting? Have them, yeah. Okay. And that's better than not. But, okay. And that's really honestly.
Sorry, we have ours in the packet for the board members for each meeting.
And that's an excellent practice. Most nonprofits, and I can see by your show of hands, or you're kind of sheepishly not looking at me when I ask that question, you don't. And that's the rules of the road. That's how the meetings are supposed to operate. So if a question comes up, it's the first thing you should be looking at. Now you can have it available electronically. I'm not saying you have to have it on your desk and do the checklist sort of thing, but that's a nice policy to have it available and readily there to figure out, how do we do this? We're looking at a purchasing issue. What's our standard on how much value has to be on a particular item before certain steps need to be taken? All those things should be in your bylaws, and they should be accessible to your board members. When you're talking about that responsible board, engaged board, they need to know what the rules are. They need to know how this thing works. They need to be expected to kind of be engaged that way. Examples of a breach of obedience. Knowing that a homeless shelter is supposed to have multiple places for egress, but allowing one exit to remain blocked. Are you following the rules? Those are state, local, federal rules for fire purposes, et cetera, et cetera. But if you know about it and you don't fix it, things like that. Fire lane issues, that's one of them I see pretty regularly. Well, there's no parking, so everybody just kind of parks there. There's a reason they have fire lanes. If you have a fire, you want a fire truck to be able to get in there. Accepting donations for specific projects, spending money on something else. Not following financial policies regarding separation of duties and handling money. Duties of care, loyalty, obedience are part of providing oversight, which is one of those three responsibilities of that board of directors and that overall overarching fiduciary duty. Handling money, I like to give this example with our law students. A lot of their organizations, they sell t-shirts for like $10 or whatever. And we always require that 2 of them count the money from the little t-shirt sales over lunch. And they may sell 2 or 3 t-shirts, it's 20 or 30 bucks. But 2 of them count it together, they put it in an envelope, they seal the envelope, and they both sign over the sealed envelope. That's our financial policy. Does it matter if we lose 20 or 30 bucks? The grand scheme of the world, probably not. But it protects them, it protects the other people in the chain of dealing with that money and doing the deposit. It keeps everybody honest. It's just a good financial policy to have. So there are things like that you should do because they're the right, smart way to do things. Even though it's maybe one more step sometimes, those are the things that can help you comply with these duties that you have and get the board in that mindset of kind of doing things the right way for the right reasons. Now, as I've kind of mentioned, all of these duties kind of interlap and overlap a little bit, and they're all kind of part and parcel of your fiduciary duty. Well, the board's not usually involved in day-to-day activities of the organization. It is responsible for managing the organization, making important decisions, such as adding or removing board members, hiring, firing officers and employees, and including the executive director, engaging auditors, other professionals, including attorneys. We'll touch on that a little bit, I'm sure. As well as authorizing significant financial transactions, investments. I know you have another session here that deals with investments for your nonprofit, that sort of thing, and new program initiatives. Members of a board of directors must fulfill their fiduciary duties to the organization and the public it serves. You get 501c3 tax-exempt status, and the rest of us have to pay more in taxes to support the cost of running the community. And in return for that, you are obligated to follow these rules and do good things for your organization and for the community. That's the trade-off, that's the handoff. In Kansas, there's also personal property tax exemption. There's other things as well. But the concept here behind that fiduciary duty in part is you're getting these things, you're getting to be tax exempt, so we want to make sure you're doing the right things that you said you were going to do as an entity. And you got to get your board members kind of engaged in understanding, yeah, this is why we're doing these things. We're not just doing them as busy work. These are things that we need to do to comply with these requirements. A lot of times you can think about those fiduciary duties as kind of the financial obligations of the board. It's a little narrower than what it really means. But for example, investments, you have to take kind of those steps of another prudent person that they would take in making the best decisions for the organization. Here, not too many years ago, we had a real economic downturn. Things in the investment world went to crap real quick. And boards that had taken reasonable steps to have their investment advisors come in, tell them what's going on, make good decisions, rely on good advice, even though they lost a lot of value, were not liable because they'd taken reasonable steps that a prudent person, a prudent board would take to watch those things. Okay? Conflict of interest policy, and then we'll move on to do the problem here in a second. And I'll happily take any questions that you have as well. Do you guys have a conflict of interest policy in your nonprofits? Okay. Usually some folks don't. If you want an idea of where to go to get a conflict of interest policy, the people that are policing you to make sure you have a conflict of interest policy are the IRS. Website, irs.gov. There's 50 different versions out there, and as a lawyer, I can write you a 10-page version of it, but the folks that are looking to see if you're doing this are IRS, and they have just very nice, straightforward, simple conflict of interest policies. You should absolutely have one, and you should update it every year. Make sure your members are saying at the annual meeting, what other interests do I have? What other outside interests might I have? Might a spouse or significant other have? And my wife and I both do them for both of our organizations that we're serving on. All right, talking about conflicts of interest, real-life examples, an organization engages in potential conflicts without a bidding process, disclosure of personal interest, maybe not having the board discussion they should have. An example, and I've used this one forever, so it was entertaining me that the online folks use this one too. Hiring a company owned by a board member who has a professional stake or will receive a commission. For example, the board hires an HVAC company owned by a board member who then receives pay from the organization for the work performed. You've got your nonprofit, your heating and air unit goes out, and one of your board members who happens to have an HVAC company says, I'll tell you what, if you will buy our brand of unit, I'll sell it to you at cost, and I won't charge you installation. Is that a conflict of interest if you do that? What do you guys think? They want to make sure that they can hear you on the mic since they're recording.
You have to always follow your procurement policies for your organization, and it has to be open for a fair bid according to your procurement policies. So going outside of those policies violates that and should get you in a lot of trouble.
Could. Yeah, that's not a bad answer. There are situations, if it's an emergency situation, it's over a weekend, if you're dealing with kids or puppies and kitties or whatever, that you may need to do something in an emergency situation. Who knows? Go ahead.
So my answer would be maybe. What if they were in a really small town and this was the only HVAC company in a 100-mile radius and there were no other options? And so they were a board member who was well-suited to provide this service. This has come up with our board that someone was able to translate into a foreign language, and they were uniquely suited to provide that service. Is that an exception?
Yes, and I love that you use the word maybe. In the lawyer land, we like to use the word it depends. That's all one word. It's the regular answer of, well, it depends. Because he's absolutely right in what he's saying. As a rule, if you have a policy, you should follow the policy, you should do all those things. That's absolutely a right answer. But your answer is right too. It depends. If you're in a situation where there's only one person in town and they're going to charge you less, well, that's different. But you should probably still have a conversation as a board to say, all right, here's what we've got. And that person should probably recuse themselves if they're on the board from the vote. And the board, you can talk about, there's nobody else. Yeah, we could go over another town, and then we pay driving fees back and forth and everything else. And at the end of the day, this is who's going to repair it for us anyway down the road. and this will be the brand of unit that they like to repair. It's the conversation, basically. So yeah, it's a conflict, but it's not necessarily a conflict that isn't acceptable to the organization. And that's really what you got to think about with these conflict policies. I see boards either be one extreme, we absolutely can't do anything, or the absolute other extreme, oh, it doesn't matter, this is okay. And it's kind of a balance between those two.
What I've had to do in situations like that is I've brought it to the board and said, if we know there's a situation like what she said is where we actually vote on something and put it in a policy in place that we can use this vendor knowing that this relationship exists so that it's stated and documented in our meeting notes and everything going forward, so everything is above water. And I come from the engineering world where it says if it is not documented, it didn't happen. So
yeah, that you make a good point there. And one of the things I usually encourage, especially not smaller nonprofits, to have is a provision in their purchasing provisions that allows the director, the CEO, the manager, whatever your position is, to consult with the chairperson or the chair and vice chair of the board on an emergency purchase, and then reflect that at the next regular board meeting. I mean, there's ways to deal with kind of that emergency scenario. And again, it's just those good, logical, common sense sort of approaches to a problem that you would do in your own home. You know, okay, I'm eldest child and I'm at home watching the house and mom and dad are gone and the air conditioner breaks down. Well, I should probably call one of them and find out who they like to use and find out what steps I should take and find out what next steps I should, just the reasonable, prudent person sort of things are the same sort of things you want to do as a board. Now, they're more involved because you have a board and you want to have people recuse themselves if they have a personal interest, and you want to have conversations among the board, and you want to have those questions and that engagement, but ultimately kind of the same sort of thing. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
I have a question about the level of detail that one would need to disclose on the conflict of interest. So I've had board members, I'm an executive director, I've had board members who have said, I don't have any. They turned in their form, none, and signed it. I'm like, oh, wait a minute, everybody has something. Like if you're employed, your employer would be the conflict of interest. So how would you describe to a board member what to disclose on a conflict of interest?
All of us together now, the favorite words of an attorney, it depends. The advice I usually give is, if there's something that you think might be, list it. It's not a bad thing to list it, but it gives everybody kind of an opportunity, and it protects you personally in saying, hey, this might be one, I just want to lay this out there. And quite honestly, even within a board meeting, if there's something that comes up that may or may not be, just say, hey, I just want to lay this out there. I have an interest in, I did work for this group. My family owns a controlling interest in that organization. When I do mine for Washburn University, I include a lot of things because Washburn ends up partnering with lots of different entities that I may have nothing to do with that partnership, but we are a partner and there are financial grants and things like that that are involved in that. So they know. And they can say, yeah, we checked and that's not an issue. He's not involved in anything with that there. Does that help? It depends. I mean, it's literally, it's that reasonableness sort of thing. And you'll be fine if you engage in the reasonableness sort of measure.
Okay, so I have a fairly specific situation also.
And I won't give you direct legal advice, but I'll talk about
That's
generalities.
fine.
So you have a hypothetical problem,
Okay, I
right?
have a hypothetical situation.
I like hypotheticals.
So we've had a lot of conversation about a lot of our policies.
Right.
I came into a very grassroots organization in 2019, and we've been actually like putting the foundation in under the house kind of thing.
A tough time for all nonprofits, of course.
Uh-huh. And so, but lately we've had a lot of conversation around our conflict of interest. And so, like, hypothetically, it's time to renew the insurance policy, and we have an insurance agent on our board. If we're getting estimates, my board is split on whether or not that agent can or should also be invited to give us an estimate.
Here's my take on that, and
It
this is
depends,
honestly
I
my
know.
take with knowing limited information. Gosh, yes, I want them to bid. Why wouldn't I want to at least see a bid? Now, you can say, oh, well, then if they bid, then there's a possibility that people will feel like they got to give it to them. And yeah, but if you're having a good, solid board that has that engagement and looks at it and looks at the numbers and looks at what else is offered and that sort of thing, I think you want that information. I will tell you, for some of the organizations I've been involved in, large organizations, one of the things I always push our folks to do is get more bids. I do not want to hear from you, well, there's only 2 groups here within the region that sell widgets, and widgets are what we wanted. Well, were widgets the only thing, or was the widget plus something that we might have been able to get if we had a couple more bids? So to me, it's always, I want to see more, I want to see that. Others might disagree with me and say, you know, out of an abundance of caution, and especially if there have been past issues, then we need to look outside. One of the things I would look for with any insurance agency is, are they a sole company representative, or are they an independent agent that can represent multiple companies? Independent agents are your friend, especially with a nonprofit, because they can go out there and say, hey, here's what I got, here's what I'm shopping for, and they can get you 4 or 5 bids, getting exactly honed in on what you want. Sorry, long answer to your question, but all those pieces fall into that. Other questions? We'll move on to the problem here in just a second, but that'll probably get you other questions you'll start thinking about. Excuse me. The examples I talked about, if the conflict's disclosed ahead of time, you have a board discussion, you have a proper and equitable bidding process. All those things might be allowable. It's different. Sometimes the voice of public opinion in the general community, you want to factor that in on how you may or may not consider a particular bid. All those things are things you should talk about. Have the conversation as a board. If you have a person on the board that has that personal interest, they need to recuse themselves and set out of the meeting for that particular conversation. But it's the conversation you need to have more than anything. Okay? Conflicts are not automatic. Not an automatic no, but require disclosure, consideration, and voting. All right, here's our problem. First and foremost, I like puppies and kitties. This is not associated with any particular entity. Topeka probably has 30 different entities that do animal stuff. My wife and I foster kittens, and we've done it for multiple different groups. As a lawyer, this is not any particular group. This is what I wrote the problem about. I'm going to go ahead and read it over here in just a second, but if you'd like to read ahead on your own, please feel free to do so. Then we'll move on. Purposes of the problem: assume that you're a new board member on the board for, say, the kitties and puppies. You found out that the former board member that you replaced resigned her position at the same time as 3 other board members did so, and there are only 8 positions on the board in total. You're a little uneasy with the knowledge. At the first meeting you attend, the Save the Kitties and Puppies CEO closes the door, tells the board that she has uncovered the fact that an employee has stolen over $10,000 from Save the Kitties and Puppies over the last year. Your annual budget's only $200,000. CEO suggests that Save the Kitties and Puppies make arrangements to let the employee pay it back, keep the matter quiet since the employee has kids and a family to support. Other board members speak up and want to turn the employee into the local police for theft and let them sort it out. What's your position? What do you think? Anybody brave enough to have a position on this? Whoever's open.
I would ask to see the policies and procedures for those scenarios, because they should have something about theft, embezzlement, that kind of thing on the books, and see what that guidance is and how clear it is.
Our theft policy. Oh, go back here. And then you.
Yeah, part of my question was, if a crime is committed, does that overstep even your policies, so to speak? Let me explain that. Like, in this case, a crime has been committed for a good percentage of your annual budget. And at that point, like, don't you have to report that?
Do we know a crime has been committed? Are we concluding a crime has been committed?
I thought your statement said.
And if so, what crime are we concluding has been committed? And if so, by who?
So we don't hold that statement there that says it tells the board that she has uncovered the fact that an employee has stolen over $10,000.
I'll come back to you. Who told you that? I'm being somewhat facetious here. Who told you that statement?
The CEO.
Do we like our CEO? Do we trust our CEO? I don't like my CEO. My CEO just showed up and told me 10 grand disappeared over the last year, and my CEO didn't tell me a darn thing about $10,000 disappearing over the last year until tonight. And my CEO may or may not be throwing somebody else under the bus.
But she'd have a show. I guess I read into that you'd have to, for any allegation, right, you have to bring proof. You can't just take one person's word without any kind of proof and data and different things of that nature that show.
And that's one of the other pieces here when we're coming back to the due diligence and the prudent person sort of perspective and everything else. You want to do some research. One of the simplest things, and I'm not here to drum up business for lawyers, I'm truly not, but you can get a lawyer to either do some pro bono work or pay a minimal amount to get them to come in and do it and do an inspection for you, do an investigation for you, do some interviews for you, and figure out what's actually going on. Before we make any immediate rush decisions, what are the facts? Because you got behind closed doors a CEO telling you something, and that may or may not be something you can rely on. Some of the tougher things I've seen with nonprofits is dealing with a problematic CEO, especially when you've given them a lot of control and a lot of power, and they haven't had a lot of checks and balances. Please.
The CEO should be booted from the room. And then and then the board needs to convene on what their plan of action is going to be moving forward to figure out. We need to call back our financial advisor from this morning to go through the financials to figure out what's been happening. So
the reality is, I purpose of getting a $200,000 budget, 10 grand out of 200,000. That's a big chunk of money. Either the financials aren't reflecting it right, or there's something there that you guys, even with minimal financial experience, should have been asking questions about, et cetera, et cetera. One of the examples I'll give you that I do, and I've done this every time, especially when I've served as the treasurer on the boards I've been on, I asked every month our accounting person one question. Something in the financials that either wasn't clear to me or I didn't completely understand or looked weird. I'd ask them to explain it to me before the board meeting, and then I'd ask them again at the board meeting to walk through it. So all of my board members were hearing, here's how we account for this, and here's how we put this here, and this is why this shows up over here, and here's why this was negative until we move this over there. So every month, my board members got a little 2-3 minute tutelage on a different part of the financials. Now, to me, that was a positive thing for a board. I kind of fulfilled my responsibility as being treasurer, and it helped my board members fulfill their responsibility of getting a little more education each month about how the numbers worked and why those things were different and kind of what stood out. And I was never mean to our accountants. I always told them ahead of time. So, and quite honestly, the last one I did this with thought it was genius. Said, I've been wanting to explain more things, but nobody ever asked me questions, so I don't feel like I can volunteer it. I'm like, well, I'm going to volunteer for you. It worked very smoothly. Other thoughts on this one? We'll add a couple pieces to it here in a second. And I'll certainly take other questions. Let's add this to it. Do you try to keep the matter quiet and out of the local newspaper? Your personal business does a lot of advertising with the paper. The editor would be nervous about losing your personal business account. Do you use that influence or threat? I always joke about Topeka being the biggest small town in America, but most of us that are here know the people that are in the news media, know the people that are advertising. Everybody's kind of connected. You could ask either politely or encourage. What do you think about that? I think we have.
I don't know if I have the right answer, but I think not legal situations like this that have come up when there's other issues within the community that have some kind of tension or headbutting, and it's going to get aired on a public stage. My intention, representing the organization as the organization's representative, is to get in front of the conversation. And so, does that have the best interest in making sure all of the information is laid out on the table? I'm not sure, but getting out to kind of make a presentation of information that would already disclose anything that could be brought up in a harsher negative light, so that you're kind of disabling. That's a special interest, right? So the idea is kind of disabling, but also to make sure that the actual information is represented and not misinformation that then has to be responded to. Never want to be in a position of response, but one of initiating conversation.
Offensive instead of defensive, if you can. And part of that is literally the things I've been talking about as a board, having those conversations and saying, okay, how do we want to respond to this? Not, yes, let's send them over to the sheriff right away. We don't care. It's, all right, let's get some more information and decide what do we want to do and what order do we want to do it and why do we want to do it in that order. There's even if you're by default decided, yes, we're going to turn it over to the sheriff, how are we going to do that? And who are we going to put out to speak to the public? Is our CEO going to speak? Is our board chair going to speak? What's the message that we want to share? All those things are part and parcel of it. Do we have other people who want to speak over here? I thought I saw hands up. Other thoughts? Are you going to move on to one more problem? All right. Board's planning a major fund drive in the near future, investing over $20,000 into advertising and promotion of that goal. Would the theft information hurt the donations you expect from the fund drive? Does that impact how you want to deal with the problem? And how soon? And how public? And what do you think? Nobody wants to pipe up now? I keep layering stuff on and everybody gets more and more nervous about having an opinion now.
I'll bite.
All right.
I think, so I'm an executive director.
Yes. And let me say, there aren't wrong answers to this.
If I were a board member, and even in my executive director role, I mean, I think that transparency is highly valuable and highly valued by our donors. And so in my mind, it would make sense to be as transparent as we can be, gathering the information, doing our due diligence first, all that stuff. Because when we're asking people to donate, we want people to know that their donation is going to go to what they're donating for. So if it's puppies and kittens, your money is going to go to puppies and kittens. And we're going to be good stewards of that money. Because if it comes out after the drive or during the drive, then your donors do shut down because you do not appear to be good stewards of the money that they're putting forth.
A little bit of that, we made a mistake and we're going to fix it, sort of thing. Go ahead, and then we have Laura as well.
I heard a quote that transparency is not sharing every detail. It's sharing the reason for the decision that you're making. And I think part of this, I feel like goes back to my core, though, of wanting to be a person of integrity. And that doesn't mean sharing every detail. Like, I have kids. And me and my wife make some decisions for my family. We don't share with my kids every detail around the situation. There are times where we have to explain that, hey, mom and dad are making this decision because we believe it's best for the family, and here's why we believe it's best for the family, but we don't share all the details because they're not able to handle all those different details. And so I don't want to do things, I want to be authentic, and I think that's important. I never want to threat anybody. I think you have to continue to operate with good, sound principles according to your moral compass. And I think that's a part of the 3 Ds that you introduced us to in the F at the beginning, and operating that way. And so in this, I believe that's also, as a part of those 3 Ds and the F, is even though this person did something wrong, is still treating them as a person. with dignity and worth, because we're supposed to be in the nonprofit sector and believe that about all people. And so that would mean how you communicate, I guess, even if you're going to turn that person into the legal crime. Like, are you making this public because you want to shame them, or are you taking action because you actually want to recoup the funds? I think there's a difference in that, and that plays into this also. Are you taking the actions that you are because you're more worried about the money, or are you worried about maintaining your integrity as an organization?
I like having the kids on a need-to-know basis. Now, beyond that, a lot of the points you made are the points we've been talking about and I've been raising so far. It's that evaluating transparency for the right purposes, transparency to the extent reasonably appropriate. All those things are those balances, and part of that is the board as a whole having the conversation of what do we want to share, what next steps do we want to take, what order do we want to take them in, all those things.
I suggest to our board that our credibility, the organization's credibility and reputation is its biggest asset, more than the bank account. Because if we had to rebuild, if someone walked away with every penny that we had and the organization had to rebuild from scratch, the only asset that we have is our organization's reputation and credibility. So when I'm thinking about these questions, yes, I would talk to the newspaper person and leverage my relationship with them to get ahead of the story so that we could do some damage control. And I think transparency to the level that's necessary to instill confidence so that our funding drive is successful, because people understand that we've corrected the wrong. But I think every decision along this process, to me, would be guided by what's in the best interests of our organization's reputation, because it's our biggest asset.
Excellent. Others want to add? Over here. I'll add on to that. A number of years ago, just down the road here is the cemetery on the north side of Interstate 70. The company that owned that ended up basically engaged in a pyramid scheme in about 8 states. So Shawnee County ended up with it. The county or the city ends up with an abandoned cemetery, basically. So I ended up spending most of the year on TV explaining what these people had done and that the people had prepaid and these little ladies no longer had their money to bury their family, et cetera, et cetera. So I spent a year of that accountability for these criminals that actually ended up prosecuted in Georgia. So I completely understand, even in that case on behalf of the county, it was provide the information, provide the facts, provide the next steps, provide the things they can do, even though it really sucked, was really bad. It was get the information out there so at least folks knew kind of what was going on and weren't trying to fill in the blanks on their own.
Hi, I'm a relatively new executive director, and we have a tiny board, and I would really love to hear from you or anyone else here. How do you go about thinking of who to bring onto your board, and what is that? Do you give them a packet? Do you give them a job description? How do you recruit them? And I guess that's it. Anything else you want to say about how you recruit people to be on your board, what I should be thinking about, and then how often should you be communicating with them once you have them on your board?
Okay. Let me touch on a few different things here for you, because that's a whole nother hour or two. But we'll give you the concise version of it. When you're looking at who to recruit for your board, what are you trying to accomplish? Have the goal for that particular position, and all of them will be different, of what you're trying to accomplish. There was one board I sat on that I actively wanted us to get a young person that was engaged in the youth, and I'm talking the 20-somethings, not the old gray guys like me. And that for that position, we wanted someone of ethnicity and young that was involved in that part of the community. And we found someone, and it was great. And then after that, we were able to kind of focus on some other things, some accounting folks, some legal folks to get rid of me down the road. They're all kinds of different things. So figure out what you're trying to accomplish. Have a goal with each position, and really look at it when you're looking at who you're trying to recruit. One of the things I strongly encourage, and we do this with the library, each month we do a kind of an educational piece for our board members on how this program works or how that grant works or what's coming up that we're going to have to fix because it's falling apart. I mean, whatever you want to call it, but it's basically trustee education. And have something every month and just get in the routine of doing that. And it doesn't have to be more than 5 or 10 minutes, but have something like that. For your new folks, have a literal packet that has the bylaws, that has past meeting minutes, that talks about what the purposes of your organization is, that has some handouts on conflict of interest policies, on board duties. Send them to board training. Do any of those things that make sense, no matter what your size is. A lot of those things you can do without a lot of effort to get them kind of in the mindset of, oh, these folks are serious about doing this right. So either A, they're going to engage and say, I like this, I want to be on this board, or B, they're going to say, I don't like that, and you then get rid of the person that otherwise would not have been a good board member anyway. Does that make sense? And that's pretty direct, but I see too many people on boards that are filling a spot and doing nothing, and those sometimes are the most problematic folks you got, especially if you have too many of them, and you got some good folks that want to do the right thing and want to be responsible, and then you got folks that, well, that's going to be a lot of work, I don't want to do that, and your votes start getting really weird and wonky. That's kind of what I would say. Go ahead.
I would just add to that, as someone who's done this for almost 3 decades, is it's not always a great thing, especially if you're at a small nonprofit, where you meet someone, you think they meet the requirements, and you just put them on the board. As much as committees can be a real pain. And one more thing to manage, that is a great way of sort of dating potential board members or creating some way of having a pipeline, because once someone is on the board, you've made that commitment and you realize things aren't working out, there are things that you can do to kind of mitigate that, and having some ways of connecting with them and working with them. So it's kind of dating on each other, right, before you hop into the board.
Put them on the finance committee and see how they do. Seriously, no, that's a good place to start, because then they can get a flavor too of, is this a healthy organization? Do I want to be on this board? And they can make some good decisions from that perspective as well. Other questions on that? What if you kept it quiet initially, but ultimately became aware of the people around town? We're talking about the former employee having a gambling problem, wondering how they supported it on the salary of a nonprofit agency like Save the Kitties and Puppies. Just kind of another layer there. We don't have to go into that particular piece. But other thoughts, other questions that you guys have from this particular presentation? We have about 5 minutes. Yes, go ahead. Wave in the back. Oh, wait for the microphone. And then I think, did you wave your hand too?
I do have just a quick question. When you have your board meeting, who should prepare the agenda for the board meeting?
Okay. I can share this as public information. For the Topeka Shawnee County Public Library, the executive committee actually meets on Zoom for all of about 15 minutes the week before, and the staff bring what they think should be on. We talk about that, we approve that, we have other things we want to add on. It's just a 15-minute conversation about structuring it a week before the meeting, so then the other things that we want more information on, our staff have enough time to put together and be ready to respond to at the next meeting. Now, we're a little bigger, we're a taxing entity as well, et cetera, but it's something as simple as that little conversation gets you something that's a little more structured, and you have buy-in from everybody. You can default to your CEO, and for a lot of organizations, that's fine, but hopefully you have a CEO that's then going out and talking to, what do you want on there, what are you curious about, what should we add? And having that trustee education piece of however you want to do it, I think is ultimately important. If you want an engaged board, if you want a board that's asking questions, if you want a board that knows what's going on, give them some tidbits. Give them something to chew on, give them something to ask questions about, and you'll get them more engaged and more wanting to know more about kind of what's going on. All that kind of feeds upon itself. And it's not force feeding, and you're still, don't ever let a meeting go over an hour. I always try not to throw that in there, but that's my personal bias. If you're meeting for over an hour, you're doing something wrong. You need to have subcommittees doing this work or something. If you're dragging people there for over an hour, figure out how to do it differently.
So
everybody loses that attention.
I think you may have answered my question. If we're not going to go over an hour, what's the ideal frequency of board meetings?
I'm biased on this. I was with an organization that went to a bi-monthly meeting. I don't believe in bi-monthly meetings. If you can't go to a meeting once a month, I think you're losing oversight. You're losing something. I think once a month it's that happy amount of you got a monthly cycle sort of thing with the organization. You're asking questions, you're getting answers. You can catch things quickly enough that they don't become a real problem. 2 months is a lot of time. Things can go a long ways, good or bad, over that 60-day period. I like to see them once a month. Others will say it depends how your organization, how they oversee, how many things are being done with subcommittees or committees. And if you have all the work really being done there and it's just a reporting out, that's different. I like the once a month. I'm not big on the every couple months.
You may have already addressed this, and I'm sorry if so. Do you have thoughts on virtual versus in-person meeting? I know both have pros and cons, but given your experience, what are your thoughts?
We touched base and had that question on Tuesday when we met, and I like that it was brought up. I am of the opinion both hybrid, having a Zoom option for folks that can't get in, because a lot of times you'll have folks that life happens, or they're in a meeting, or they're traveling, and they can get on Zoom for an hour meeting, but they're out of state or something like that. I think you get more engagement that way, but at the same time, encouraging all those that are able to be in person. So you have that personal touch, personal engagement, that sort of thing, and that you can do both. I get a little nervous when people absolutely want to get rid of Zoom. Well, I understand it, but it's got its purpose, it's got its place. But it all depends on what your organization does and how it's structured and what's right for you. And talking to your organization. Let me add one more thing and then I'll get to your question. As you get a new board in every year, whatever your annual meeting is, my wife's in another nonprofit, so when I finish there, I have to go to her annual meeting at the other nonprofit. And part of what they try to do is every year ask the board members when they want their meeting to be. So just because it's always been at 4 o'clock, I think they're shifting to go to 5 o'clock because they have enough folks that have kids they're picking up at school, and 5 o'clock was better for more of them. So they're gonna have more people show up at 5 o'clock. So don't just, by gosh, for the last 10 years, we've always been at this time, get stuck there. Understand there's other options. Understand that meetings need to work within the people that you have. Go ahead.
We made a large regional expansion, so we now encompass 10 counties. And so having board representation from outside of where our main housed office is really important to us as we've made that expansion. But like you were saying, the Zoom option and, that seems to be the only thing I can really come up with for attendance requirements for them, that somebody that's located, because that 10 county, it's a far reach for us. So I kind of struggle just with that engagement component with having somebody so far. I struggle with that sometimes.
I will say for myself, the Supreme Court, I do some things with them, and they literally commented to me at one point, we're happier to have you on Zoom than to not have you at all. And I'm like, I was apologizing because I'm in town, but I have to be back for the next meeting. It's not that I can't do the meeting. I just have to be somewhere for the next thing. And Zoom lets me do that. So their attitude is always, hey, we know lawyers are busy. We know judges are busy. Whatever works is fine. We're fine with that. And God forbid for a statewide organization, we have 3 counties that are in the next time zone over on the Colorado border. People don't realize that. God forbid you're an hour difference and then you're trying to drive to get to a meeting and everything else. Wow. Other questions? We're right up at time, I think.
Yeah, maybe one more final question if anyone has one.
Again, if you address this, Shawn, I apologize. So travel stipends, any type of financial payment to board members for their time or at least their travel, what are the rules around that? I know. Final question.
Another hour-long conversation. Quite honestly, the lawyer answer is, it depends. If you have folks, especially that are of moderate means, and you want to get representation, especially from users for your organization, and they are not going to financially be able to afford to drive to a meeting every month and things like that, you can do bus passes, you can do gift card, you can do things that are reasonable as long as you're not overtly compensating them beyond a reasonable expense of doing it. Now, you get into for-profit corporations, you can do whatever you want. But with nonprofits, it's really looked at fairly closely to make sure you're not compensating them for the service, you're offsetting expenses of providing the service. Does that make sense? And I really can't go much farther than that because there's nuances depending on what you're doing. And some organizations get very creative about what they can do. There are annual meetings that you may go to. I mean, I go to a couple of annual meetings, but I go to there because I want to figure out of the 3 vendors that are going to provide a widget, I want to talk to those vendors and get my own information that I don't have to trust my people telling me, oh no, we need widget A. Well, no, we don't really need widget A. Widget B's does exactly the same things. And I talk to the people that sell widget B. You understand? So it's all kind of relative. Good question. Literally worth another hour of time. So thank you for having me today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Shawn. We really enjoyed it.